praise you. You're a great God. Thank you so much for all that you've done for us. We're very grateful. And thank you for your word and your wisdom. We seek your wisdom tonight. Ask that you would teach us, help us to understand these things. Worldviews, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we finished up with Islam last week, and now we're going to move into modernism and postmodernism. But I did want to ask, is there any questions about Islam from last week? Any thoughts? Okay. Well then, let's go ahead. Now we're going to look at modernism and postmodernism. Kind of understand how we got to where we're at least in the Western world. and so we need to understand modernism in order to understand postmodernism, because postmodernism is a reaction to modernism. Okay? So what is modernism? And modernism, and there's debates on exactly when did it come around, but certainly the movement of rationalism and the whole scientific revolution and so forth brought us into this modern state of understanding, and you can see it in American Revolution, French Revolution, and other things like that that brought in some basic beliefs and understandings that weren't there prior to modernism. And my clicker's not working. It should be working. There we are. A few things about modernism to just kind of the way people think today. First of all, is individualism. The idea that it's all about me. And prior to this, people, obviously you had selfish people throughout history, but there really was a corporate understanding of people. And but the autonomous individual really is how people think in the Western world, and that's, you can even see the United States. How did we become a country? We had a Declaration of Independence. That's okay. We don't need that country over across the pond. It was the idea, and then you had this this movement out west, and they called that rugged individualism. Where you get out there, you have nobody but yourself, and you can pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Actually, sociologists have studied, all of that and found out that it was an absolute miserable failure. People did meet each other. They did end up developing communities and so forth. But this individualist mindset became rampant in modernism. Second is rationalism, where reason became the sole basis for knowledge. Where, what are some ways in which we can obtain knowledge?
Studying.
Okay, that's how we can get it, by studying, yeah. Okay.
Reading it.
Huh?
By actual reading.
So reading, that'd be learning from somebody else. Right. Okay. So passing down knowledge.
Testing or experimenting.
Okay, experimenting, and these are knowledge that we're gaining from our five senses, right? So that would be one. Our five senses are a source of knowledge. What you can see, hear, touch, smell, taste. Did I get them all? Okay. So the five senses become a major source of knowledge. Oh, I thought you were saying something. Okay, experience is a but once again, is that an experience from one of these five senses? See, the five senses became a huge source of knowledge to where people said, that's really the only thing that's real. It's what you can hear, taste, see, feel, touch. If you can't obtain that knowledge from these five sources, then it's not real knowledge. And that became the idea that the universe is physical only. Okay? Now, the rationalists, though, they argue that the senses can be deceiving, can't they? I mean, if I go by sight, you all are blurry. Okay? Right? If I go by sight, this world looks flat. Okay? That's, those kinds of things. So they, the rationalists argue that you can, what you can reason, and using basic logic became a major source of knowledge. And usually a combination of those two, whether it's the five senses or using basic logic, those two things combined became the sole source of knowledge. Can you think of any others? Let me throw what? Revelation is a source of knowledge if there is a God, right? So if God chose to speak, now He is Spirit, if the Bible's right on about God, then there's no five senses kind of a thing, right? So it's beyond the five senses and just the basic logic, though it doesn't go against those things. But if God speaks, then revelation becomes a source of knowledge. But that's, in the modernist world, that's rejected. How about intuition? Is that a valid source of knowledge? Have you ever sensed something? You didn't have reason, you didn't have the five senses, but ended up being right? Is that a valid source? I don't know. I mean, it's at least a potential valid source, but in modernism, if there's only the physical matter, then that it's ruled out automatically, intuition. So there's other sources of knowledge, but for rationalism, especially reason becomes the sole basis for knowledge. And then,
so emotion doesn't play a part at all in rationalism?
Right, rationalism would say emotionalism. In fact, when you study the rationalists, they were very opposed to emotional excesses. That you need to push down emotions. Because that's when you usually think of intuition, you think of an emotional sense, so to speak. Okay?
So how would they view psychics?
View what? They would simply say there has to be some rational, some reason behind it that we just haven't discovered yet. If they were right or whatever, there has to be some reason. So there's no spiritual realm. There's only the physical. This is the only way in which we can discover truth. Okay? Now, modernism affects even religious people, so it's not that they completely abandon religion or even revelation, but all of that becomes subject to reason. Reason becomes the supreme source of knowledge and of discovering what is right and wrong and what is true and false. Reason becomes the supreme leader in all of that. Now, and all of us have everyone has a supreme means in which they decide what's right and wrong, what's true and false, right? And I think I've shared this before. There's basically three supreme authorities. Either self, or tradition, or revelation. Okay? Those are the only three options that are available. Rationalists make self the supreme source. Now, what we'll see with postmodernism, they move heavily into emotion. That emotion becomes the supreme leader, but either rationalism or emotion is still self, being the supreme authority. So I am my supreme authority. Is there any problems with that?
fallible.
What's
I
that?
am fallible.
You are fallible. I was going to ask, what do you know about yourself, is what I was going to ask. And Patty is willing to admit, okay, that she is fallible, okay? And I'll put my hand up for myself as well. That we're fallible. And we're fallible because we're not perfect in knowledge or perfect in our ability to reason, are we? So rationalism, because we're not, why do you think philosophers disagree with each other? because there's, when you get down to those fine-tuned arguments, the one says, well, yeah, but this, and the other says, well, yeah, but this, and it's and it's all because we really can't. We're not smart enough to figure everything out. So there's lots of holes, but not only are we small, we're also sinful, if we're willing to admit it. Meaning, we twist things to go our way, the way we want to believe. And we naturally do that because we all have a sinful nature. Now, that's from the biblical standpoint. The rationalists reject that, okay? But if it's true, it does negate rationalism as being at least a good supreme authority. Perhaps it's the only one we got anyway, and so we just have to opt for it. But if we have a sinful nature, but if you do some rational discoveries of history, what do you come up with as far as human beings?
They're irrational.
Well, we have a sinful nature. The world's in the mess it's in, not because everybody's good and everybody has a great ability to use reason and is kind to each other. No, we're in the mess we're in because we're bumping into each other all the time. We have selfishness, and when someone cuts you off on the road or something happens, it's always their fault, right? Has it ever been your fault? I mean,
Well,
I'll
sometimes.
admit something.
Sometimes.
I confess with football. I fully admit that I am totally biased towards my team. That it's almost always the other team's fault when something happens and they throw a flag on the Vikings. Forget it. Those refs got paid off or something. And I know that I am bent in that direction. But the point in all this is that reason really it's not foolproof by any means. Once again, if that's all we got, if revelation isn't there is no God, and then therefore there would be no revelation, then we just have to either go by self or tradition, and tradition is just a bunch of selves, making the same mistakes or whatever. So you're one of those two. So modernism making us just a physical entity, negating any possibility of there being an immaterial aspect to who we are, soul. It rules out a lot of stuff. It rules out love. Love, according to the modernist, is simply a chemical reaction that takes place in the brain due to DNA and genetics and so forth. And so it's not real. But is love real? Elizabeth says yes.
I'll say yes.
Okay, yeah. It is. There is a part of me that I know is me that isn't physical. Now, I can't rationally explain it, but I know it's there. Okay? And that's because, according to the Scriptures, we are made both material and immaterial. There's a soul and there's a body to us. And so, but that's from Revelation, if Revelation is correct. But here's the problem with modernism. It has all automatically ruled any of those possibilities out by its making reason the sole basis for knowledge. Along with this, we have science knowledge will lead to our salvation. So the rationalists believed, okay, if we just get everybody to think. So let's educate. If we can just educate everyone, get everybody to think, science will lead to our salvation. And the huge thing was we want to get to a 20-hour work week. If we can just, with science, we can develop the machines and so forth to do all the work for us. And then we just have to go to work maybe 20 hours and everybody will be able to relax and enjoy. And everyone will treat each other kindly and so forth. And we'll just have this modern utopia until we die. Okay? Yeah, and that's, so you have science knowledge will lead to our salvation. That's a major thrust of modernism. No transcendence or mystery. So there's no such thing as mystery. There's just, we haven't discovered it yet. We haven't come up with the information yet, but we will. We know it's out there. There's no transcendence. There's no being out there beyond us who is great and awesome and so forth. And so it's just this world. It's a closed system. So we have this no transcendence mystery. And then, therefore, ethics are relative. It's just relative to, society and so forth. Now, there still was a sense of ethics within modernism, though they embraced this relativism. There still was a sense of ethics that, for some reason, we're supposed to treat each other nice because we want that utopia thing. And if we don't treat each other nice, we're not going to ever get that utopia thing, right? Okay, so there still was a sense of ethics, but they confess there's no person or God out there that tells us what the ethics are, and so we just, it's relative to your situation and so forth, and so in your particular situation, yeah, maybe it's okay to lie, or maybe it's okay to, do whatever, and so ethics becomes relative, though they still try to hold on to a sense or a source of ethics for their modern utopia. This is what brings postmodernism. Postmodernism, yes?
With this whole idea of relative ethics and so forth, if there's this sense of you should treat people nicely, but so if you have someone who's mean and doesn't have a reason, then that can be right sometimes to be mean, or, it just seems inconsistent to me.
Well, it's definitely inconsistent. In fact, what we're going to discover with the postmodernists is they react against this.
Oh.
It's a reaction to modernism, and in many cases, a good reaction. Okay? Follow through here. I'll walk through it. I want to cover these in a little more detail. I love that picture. Okay.
Oh, my.
It definitely looks postmodern, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Postmodernism became disillusioned with modernity. But it was not a return to pre-modern. Okay? So they say modernism's wrong in several instances, but we don't want to return to pre-modernism, the age of the Bible and all that kind of stuff. No. So it is a reaction to. Now, the difficulty with defining postmodernism is it's just saying what it isn't, right? It's not saying what it is. It's just saying what it isn't. It's not modernism. It's a reaction to modernism, but it's not saying what it is. It's just saying it's what comes after modernism, so postmodernism. But there are some things that scholars have discovered as far as, some similarities within the way of thinking. And people disagree as to when exactly postmodernism hit, but I would argue very strongly it came in the 60s. 60s, we have a major shift in thinking in our world. And the 1960s. There was all kinds of turmoil and stuff going on, but with that, a major shift in thinking that took place from the 60s, and it just continued stronger and stronger and stronger in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and to our present time. This idea, this postmodern idea. one of the reactions, if you remember the reaction of that modernism said there's only the physical, is that postmodernism became very open to spirituality. They said, no, there is a spirituality. There is an immaterial. Now, that does not mean they embraced Christianity. In fact, usually it was a form of religion that could let you live however you wanted to live. Okay? But it was still open to spirituality. We saw the New Age movement. We talked about that and some of those other things. These are open to spirituality. So once again, a reaction to modernism, open to spirituality, but definitely not necessarily Christianity. Though, if you follow in the historical setting, with the 60s, you have this huge, sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yep.
Okay, that was like the huge thing. The 70s was the Jesus movement. Okay? And the Jesus movement was an attempt to reach the 60s people. Okay? In an attempt where they would seek to contextualize in the sense of living like them in every way but the sinful aspects. So they went barefoot. They grew the long hair. They didn't take baths often enough. They listened to rock, but Christian rock, and that's where Larry Norman and these other guys came out, okay, and so forth. But so they're an attempt to reach them, and on the coast, and this is where it started. It started out in California, reaching the surfers and all that kind of stuff. And they sought them, because these people became more open to spiritual things. They said it's Jesus, and they actually, if you remember back in those days, one of the big things. What did they say? One way. One way. There's only one way to heaven. Larry Norman sang that song. One way to heaven. That was that symbol. One way was the symbol of the Jesus movement, which is interesting because that's completely anti-postmodern in this, as we'll see in some of the other aspects. But they're introducing them. They're saying, you're right, there is a spiritual, and it's Jesus. And the 70s was probably the largest revival in our country's history. Most people think it was the first or second Great Awakening. No. It was definitely the 70s. The church just exploded in growth because of this mindset. But at any rate, I digress.
Pastor Larry?
Yes.
There were a large number of Jewish people who came to the Lord in the 70s.
Yeah, sure.
And Messianic congregations started popping up all over the country.
Now it's in the 70s. All kinds of different movements. Christianity, true biblical Christianity, just flourished in the 70s. And then the church growth movement came and the church died. It's kind of weird. Church growth movement caused the church not to grow. Okay. Well, so postmodernism open to spirituality. So this is not a bad thing, right? Now, they're open to any kind of spirituality. And as Christians, we want to introduce them to Christ. But this is not a bad thing. Once again, like the 70s, yeah, it's Jesus. Let me tell you about him. Because they're open to you telling your story now. People today, you can tell your story. Back before this,
You couldn't tell your story.
you tell your story and say, that's wrong. That didn't happen. You're just delusioned. Because you're just a physical being. And you didn't have any spiritual encounter because there's no God. Okay? So we say that's wrong. But today, because they're open to spirituality, that's your story. That's your story, and this is my story, and what's fine for you is good for you, what's fine for me is good for me. Yeah, but if they're in a place where they want to change their story, maybe they'll change it to yours. So still, it's once again, it's not, don't see this completely negatively. Now, there is some negative aspects of it, as we'll see, but open to spirituality is not a bad thing in and of itself. We just want to capitalize on that.
Did you say that modernism started right after World War II? Is that what you said?
No, 1700, 16.
Oh.
Yeah, rationalism. Enlightenment. So, yeah. Okay. Did someone else raise their hand? Okay. So, open spirituality. Let me go back to this. I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. So, no closed universe. Okay? Open spirituality. The modernism said the universe is closed. It's just the physical realm. So there is nothing outside of the physical realm. So nothing outside of the physical realm obviously can interact with the physical realm. Postmodernism, open spirituality, so it's not a closed universe. And so those are some thoughts to consider. Now, once again, the New Age spirituality really hit its, became very, very popular. And the idea that, you can just make God whatever you want him to be, that becomes very popular in postmodernism. You just have to stop and think. If you made God, that one can't be the right one. Right? I mean, I'm going back to rationalism here, using a little reason, because just because postmodernism reacts to rationalism doesn't make rationalism the enemy. It's just not a good supreme authority, okay? But it's not the enemy. So it makes a good servant, but just not a great master. Okay, so open to spirituality, rejection of individualism, at least on paper. Okay, because what's interesting, the cry, starting in the 60s and throughout, the cry has been, we need community. You can almost see this gradually as it gets more and more true. Even when you, for those of you who are my age, okay, did you ever go to concerts when you were younger?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, concerts. Did you ever go to the Rolling Stones or Pink Floyd or whatever? They were always big. I mean, 100,000 people, right? Okay, because a huge concert, lots and lots of people, but just a bunch of individuals. No community at all. You don't have community with 100,000 people. Whereas later ages, later generations, they didn't, still the big concerts today, Rolling Stones, and it's for us old people, They're still the ones packing this place down. The other ones are smaller settings because they want community. They're crying out for, they recognize that they're filled with broken homes, and they hunger, they're starving for community. But what's interesting from the studies is that though this has been the vocal cry of the postmodernists, there's still even more so individualists, more than the modernists. They did a study, a huge, massive study on words in books, and because all the books now are on digital, so you can do word searches, right? So they did this, massive word searches of hundreds of thousands of books. So this is not just a little thing. This was a huge, huge survey, and they found that now the focus, the books written now, words like I and me and those kinds of things are used way more than in the past. It is all about me, and this culture today, this postmodern culture, is extremely narcissistic. Facebook, Twitter, it's all about, I want you to know about me. It's all about me. As if does anybody even read that? I do, I like Facebook. But at any rate, so it's interesting how this cry for this rejection of individualism and a cry for community, a recognition for community, but yet not finding it. I'm going to read something from Larry Crabb, his book, The Safest Place on Earth. He describes a story, so I'm going to tell you a little story, okay? It says, it was a sight I can't forget. I've tried. In the 25 years that have passed since I saw it, only a few details have blurred. The broad features of that scene and most of the specifics remain as clear in my memory as if I had witnessed it yesterday. Rachel and I were touring Miami Beach. We had recently moved to South Florida from the gray Midwest, and were enjoying our first chance to visit the famed Sunshine Vacation Paradise.
So you're just rubbing it in tonight.
We'll see. 1 block west of the luxury beach hotels, the ones pictured on all the postcards, was a very ordinary big city street. Noisy, dirty, heavily trafficked with cabs and buses and plumbing repair trucks. The street was lined with less than elegant businesses and shops and row dwellings, with the occasional green shrub poking its way out of a square foot of dirt in the concrete. A patch of blue sky was visible only if you looked straight up. No one was snapping pictures to send home or put in scrapbooks. At one point, we walked in front of a wood-slated porch, maybe 10 feet deep, with perhaps 60 feet of sidewalk frontage. At least 100 chairs were arranged in neat rows and columns, none touching, each in exactly the same position to the others. The occupied chairs, and most of them were, each held one motionless retired man or woman staring straight ahead at the street. I can't recall seeing anyone rocking, though I'm sure someone was. I do remember that no heads turned to follow a passing taxi or pedestrian, or to chat with another porch sitter. I didn't see any crossed legs. I remember one woman's stockings were bunched around her ankles. There were no paperback novels or newspapers, not even a cup of coffee or a glass of iced tea. There was no conversation, no evidence that any of these people had been created by a relational God to enjoy intimate relating. These people's souls were asleep, numbed, I suppose, by years of lifeless relationships and pointless conversations. No doubt those conversations had all seemed important at the time. Business deals, romantic encounters, child scoldings, religious meetings, but maybe such encounters with other people had never touched anything deep enough to stir life. I remember thinking, all their lives, everyone on this porch worked hard in Detroit or New York with the dream of retiring in Florida, and now they've made it. But look at them. Everything they've lived for has come to this. Lord, deliver me from living in a manner that will leave me one day sitting in a chair next to other people who are also sitting in chairs looking straight ahead and never into one another person's eyes, never knowing anyone and known by no one. According to the Bible, God created us for community. We're supposed to be in each other's lives. We're supposed to know each other. We're supposed to have deep communion with each other and with God. That's the biblical worldview. That's what postmodernism is crying out for and hungering for, but not experiencing. Because it only comes through a relationship with Christ and involved in His calling of the church, where we're actually doing this stuff. Getting in each other's lives, being a family that really cares and talks to each other and shares the deep stuff of our hearts. Postmodernism saw what modernism had, and they rejected it rightfully. But they didn't have an answer. And so they're even more individualist than the modernists when it comes down to their narcissistic views and so forth. But can you see how they're reacting to something that was bad, but they're just simply not getting it right yet? Pessimistic towards science. The postmodernists recognized that yes, science has brought us some wonderful things, but it has also brought us some horrible things. The nuclear bomb, for instance, and these other things. Science is bringing us to this place where I look at our country, I look at our world, and, we're on the top, right? United States, we're the tough guys. We are on the top. But all of a sudden you see this cyber theft. I mean, what if somebody just figures out, just one little smart person figures out how to just dismantle our entire country's infrastructure and then destroys us? That could happen, couldn't it? Because of science. Science is not necessarily a good thing. I kind of like it. I like refrigerators. And I lived in the South, and I really liked air conditioners down there.
But I was going to say, they could knock out our satellites and nobody would have cell phones or no internet. Right?
No cell phones. That'd be even worse than getting destroyed by a nuclear attack.
Well, because of the satellites.
Yeah, but the point is, science, and this is what postmodernists have recognized, science is not necessarily our savior. It could be the thing that destroys us. Now, they're not rejecting science, but they're just becoming a little more realistic about it. They're becoming pessimistic. Have you seen that? Postmodernists have become very pessimistic because they see all of this, the potential of all this, that science has been used for good, but it's also been used for terrible things. Let me make sure. Pessimism. A general pessimism towards the future is the mark of postmodernism. Now, you could say that's bad, but is it? I mean, if I just looked at history, I think we should be pessimistic about the future if it's just up to us. Too much confidence has been placed on reason and the scientific method without taking into account the depravity of humanity. Now, postmodernists would never say human beings are basically evil. I've never heard one say that. But they actually seem to live as if that's the case. You ever see the movie or read the books, The Hunger Games? Oh, they were great. Anyway, it's The Hunger Games. If you read the books especially, all three books, all the way through all three books, it's all about killing, okay? And dying, and yet there's never even a mention of God or the afterlife. They don't even talk about it. There's no mention of heaven, hell, or anything else. There's not even, it's just, you die, they don't even say, and when you die, that's it. They don't say anything. And that's, if the whole focus of the books, all three books, is about dying and death and all this horror, and yet it never says anything. What does that say? And I find that fascinating. But all the way through it, what you find is that everybody's bad. In the Hunger Games, even the hero is bad. I found myself hating the hero because she was such a brat. It's like, come on, quit your complaining. But they painted her as, they didn't paint her as a real good person. See, modernists always had a hero, Superman, or whatever, right? You know? Whereas the postmodernists, everybody's bad. And then you die. Life sucks, and then you die. Okay? That's pessimistic attitude that we see, even in some of the. Now, I'm not saying that they once again, I don't think I've ever heard a postmodernist say, human beings are basically evil. I think if you ask them, they say, well, I think they're basically good. But, we're probably all going to die in a bomb or something like that. Okay, so they're definitely very pessimistic. But, in view of history, I'm not so sure that that's a bad thing. If we can say, you know why everybody's bad? The biblical account tells us why. Because we've left God, the only source of good. Now, they did retain and even expand modernist relativism. So they did not reject that at all. They actually expanded on modernist relativism. And I want to talk about this a little bit, okay? Because what we see here, first of all, multiculturalism. The world has grown smaller, and we're interacting with different cultures and so forth. And so how do we do that appropriately? Multiculturalism brought syncretism, where let's borrow from this religion, borrow from that culture, and so forth. And so they're just starting to learn from each other. And you see go down to a real super poor place, and they all have cell phones. And they can't afford anything else, but they got cell phones. And so we're all borrowing from each other. But syncretism is also in religious and ethical and philosophical ideas and so forth. The syncretism, we're borrowing from it. I talked about that this morning. That you can you take a little bit of this religion, that religion, you make one really good religion. But that actually morphed into full-blown pluralism. Pluralism is different than syncretism. Syncretism is where you say, I like this part of that religion or this part of that religion, you put them together. Pluralism is saying, everybody's right. This religion isn't better than that one in any way, shape, or form. They're all right, they're all equal, they're all good. Even non-religion is good. And that's full-blown pluralism. Because they don't want to say anything bad, so all religions are the same. If you pressed them, they might say Satanism's not as good. But then if you pressed them, well, what about, some of the ancient religions that, like even in the Americas where they did practice child sacrifice. Yeah, maybe that's bad. Okay, so that's so if you pushed them, but this usually they haven't thought through this idea. But the idea here, this extreme relativism, is that there is no truth. There's just stories. So there's no truth. There's no absolute out there truth. Relatively, I'm going to come back to these last two here in just a minute. But postmodern relativism starts with a radical hermeneutic. Now, I need to try to explain this because it's really important that we get this, okay, in order to see where society is today and how they base their decisions and so forth, what's happening. So it's a little complicated, but I think it would be worth our while to try to understand this hermeneutic. Hermeneutic is just a word for interpretation, okay? Interpretation. This is rooted in the deconstructionist movement of post-World War II Europe. This postmodern hermeneutic, where they argue that there is no overarching narrative. There is no overarching story, what they call a meta-narrative, that puts everything together. So there is no overarching story, there's just a bunch of stories. No story can tell another story that it's right or wrong, because they're all just stories. If you had an overarching story, here's the overarching truth and plan, then you could decide whether this story fits it or not, right? But if you don't have, if this doesn't exist, then there's just your story, and that's, and who are you to say his story is better, your story is better than his, or worse than his, or whatever, that we all just have our stories. I want to read something from Spectator's Guide to Worldviews. Kind of explains this, where this came about historically. A guy named Jean-Francois Lyotard.
That's a name.
The guy's last name is Lyotard. So I'm just saying, okay? Okay. Lyotard, a French philosopher, was commissioned in the 1970s to write a report about knowledge for the Quebec government. His resulting 1979 book, La Condition Postmoderne, the Postmodern Condition, made him famous. One of his key observations was that what we consider to be true knowledge is shaped by certain big stories that we accept about the world. These big stories give us a set of rules and principles by which we understand everything else. Lyotard described these stories as meta-narratives and concluded that in the late 20th century, these meta-narratives were less and less acceptable. People started to think that meta-narratives were simply used politically and culturally as instruments of power for controlling knowledge. Leotard wrote that in our postmodern age, we have a suspicion towards meta-narratives. There's that, that suspicion there. By which he meant that people are edgy about whether there is a big story that helps us to understand all other stories. As Homer Simpson says at the end of an episode of The Simpsons, when the characters are trying to tie together all the elements of the story, maybe it's just a bunch of stuff that happened. So, they're trying to tie in all these different stories within the cartoon or whatever. I've never watched The Simpsons. I refuse. Maybe it's just a bunch of stuff that happened. In other words, the question is raised, is there any overarching, all-encompassing piece of knowledge that helps us grasp the rest of it? Drawing on thinkers like Leotard, postmoderns tend to say, we suspect not. So, the modernists wouldn't deny a meta-narrative. They sought the utopia that there was a meta-narrative just within the universe. No outside help involved. The postmodernists have said, there's no meta-narrative. There's just stories. And so it's total relativism, absolute relativism in our understanding. He goes on and talks about in another place here. He says, because of the postmodern emphasis on playfulness and reluctance to commit to notions of the truth, this is an era of entertainment. Isn't it? Never before has so much time, so many resources, and so much creative energy gone into entertaining ourselves. One scholar, Neil Postman, has described this activity as amusing ourselves to death. 24-hour television, video games, endless movies, junk food, sport, gimmicky plastic toys, these all have some connection to the postmodern idea that we are not here on a quest for truth, but just keeping ourselves occupied as best we can while death approaches. Christians, in contrast, believe that God has given life a purpose, and it is found in worshiping and serving Him. The Christian life is to be full of good works, thoughtful use of time and resources, and ongoing efforts to further the kingdom of the Lord Jesus. Some Christians could use a bit more play in their lives because true Christianity is never uptight and has plenty of room for relaxing and enjoying yourself. But overall, there is an enormous contrast between the purposeful Christian life and the treading water gleefully while the ship sinks postmodern philosophy. And he says this, the long-running television sitcom Seinfeld had a typically postmodern feel in its determination to focus on the trivial. You ever watch Seinfeld?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Focusing on the trivial? Is he describing it right? There? The show about nothing. The whole notion that undergirded the program was a story about nothing. Each of the characters, Jerry, Elaine, George, and Kramer, appeared to be outdoing each other in who could be more superficial and shallow. It could be said to be postmodern in reacting against trying to be of any substance or to stand for anything other than entertainment. I thought we'd watch a little episode of Seinfeld just to see that. I'm sorry, Mark, I didn't steer you right on which movie's going to come first. Can we watch the Seinfeld YouTube?
That's fine.
Okay.
Where's Hunter? Oh. Definitely want to rewind the show. Just a couple of seconds. There you go.
Excuse me, would you mind watching my bag for a minute?
Yeah, no problem. So, well, I gotta watch this guy play.
For how long? Sir? Messed up. Excuse me, sir. Would you mind watching my bag for a second? Why? So I can stand here like an idiot not knowing if he'll ever come back? Where are you going? I'm going to be this guy's friend. New clothes? Yeah, I did some shopping, some new clothes, some shopping. Could find them anything.
Strange, for new pants, there's noticeable wear on the buttocks of those chinos. Wait, those are the clothes from the bag!
The guy never came back.
He asked you to watch them, not wear them.
I'm still watching him.
It's about nothing, right? No substance at all, but entertainment. Okay, that's so a radical hermeneutic. That's no meta-narrative. Now, Christianity says there is a meta-narrative. There is a story, an overarching story, that God has a plan from the beginning. And as you read through the Bible, you see his call on Abraham and then the people of Israel and how he uses them to bring about Messiah, that Jesus dies on the cross, that everything from BC to from the Old Testament and the New Testament point to Jesus. It was all prophecies focusing on the coming of the Messiah, and then now it's looking back at what Jesus did for us. And we as the church are to reach out and bring others into this incredible relationship that he provides through the forgiveness of sins. That's the overarching meta-narrative, and that Jesus Christ is coming back someday and is going to set things right. He's going to destroy evil. So there's going to be a day of judgment. So that's the overarching story. But if postmodernism's right, then there is no overarching story. And it's just a bunch of stories. And so there's no actual truth. And so everything is relative, which brings us to a radical There we got it. A radical morality. Everything is acceptable because there's no ultimate authority. If there's no ultimate authority because there's no ultimate story, then everything is acceptable. Tolerance becomes the supreme virtue. And this radical morality will lead to anarchy. There's no right or wrong, and it's just whatever you think is right or wrong. How can you tell someone else that they're wrong? How can we say that another culture, what was the American Indians in South America that sacrificed their babies? The Aztecs. How can we say to them, you were wrong? We can't. We can just simply say, that's not what we do. That's not our story, or whatever. But there's no room for improvement, because how can you improve? To improve, you have to say it's not as good back then, right? So there's no and so a radical morality. It's interesting. I was looking at these different movies that talk about codes. That a code of ethics, a code of right and wrong, a code of honor. And these different movies talk about these things, but you have to ask, if postmodernity is correct, where do you even get the idea of a code? How can you say your code's right or good? I'd like to watch one from Act of Valor, and we'll see the beginning of this movie that speaks of this code.
Louder. Relativity.
Media.
Before my father died, he said the worst thing about growing old was that other men stopped seeing you as dangerous. I've always remembered that, how being dangerous was sacred, a badge of honor. You live your life by a code, an ethos. Every man does. It's your shoreline. It's what guides you home. And trust me, you're always trying to get home.
See what he said about a code? Everyone has a code. And everyone does, don't they? Everyone has an ethos. Everyone has a sense of right and wrong. But it's different. And postmodernity is saying there's no right code because there's no overarching meta-narrative. It's just what's right for you. But what happens when what's right for you bumps into what's right for you? That's the difficulty. There's no answer to it. There's no, you can't say, well, we just all need to be nice to each other. What does that mean, nice? One person feels like it's okay to eat people. That's not nice to the person getting eaten, true. But how can we say to them, your code is wrong? Postmodernism says you can't. That everyone's code. In fact, Fast and Furious, in that movie, ends up this policeman doesn't arrest the bad guy because he recognizes he had a code. The bad guy was living by his own code, stealing cars, but he had his own code, and the police respected that and even actually helped him escape when he got caught. Did anybody see that movie?
Yes.
Okay? You know what I'm talking about? This end of it is just bizarre. He actually helps him escape because, well, he's living by his code. Who am I to say his code's wrong? But his code was stealing cars. I think we can say that's wrong. But others would say, no, it's okay. It's okay to steal from those oppressive people, rich people or whatever. We need to steal from them and give to those who have not, and so forth. Kind of the modern Robin Hoods for a day. And so this radical morality where tolerance becomes the supreme virtue. But tolerance, is it the supreme virtue? Think about tolerance. Read something from, I think this is a Convergent Church. I think this is what I wanted to read. Let's read it. Let's see. It's time to take a break. I want to finish this because we really need to understand postmodernism to see where our society is, to see how we can evaluate the postmodern worldview. So let's just, we'll stop here. But before we take a break, any questions so far on what I've shared? Yeah.
It's got that doctrine about why we even need police. Because if it's okay to, steal garbage now, you didn't see no wrong with it. And what's the purpose for the police then? And then everything should be fine, okay.
Or even a judicial system. It falls apart completely.
Yeah, well, and the postmodernists are going to say, well, we need police because we are all pretty bad. And we're all just going to get worse anyway. And so there's, but that's the point. It's an excellent question because what it's revealing is that postmodernism is illogical. But postmodernism doesn't go by logic. They have taken rationalism and said that is not the supreme authority. They've rejected rationalism as the supreme authority, but they have not made God the supreme authority. They have made themselves not their ability to reason, but rather their emotions, my feelings. You can see it in the way we talk. It used to be, you'd say, what do you think about that? Now it's, well, how do you feel about that? It's different, isn't it? Now it's all about feelings. It's not about what's true, because there is no ultimate truth. How do you feel about that? Well, I feel like we should have some police because I don't want my car stolen. You know, there's no rhyme or reason to it, but that's how they act.
What this makes me think about is
That's what?
abortion. I think it took a postmodern mindset for that to come about.
Certainly. Yeah. And when did it happen?
60s.
60s. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay, let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about postmodernism. We have this radical morality as well as now a radical pragmatism. This is how the postmodernist determines what is right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. It is by pragmatism. Pragmatism means whatever works is true. So they're not any longer concerned with what is actually true because they don't believe in an absolute truth. So what is true is what works. The question here, is pragmatism a valid test of truth? What do you think? One question I would have is, how do you determine what you even mean by does it work? What does that mean if it works? A child lies to his parents and so gets out of punishment. It worked. So that was true. His lie was true, right? But did it work? Did that help the child or hurt the child? I would say it hurt the child. Huh?
Long term or short term?
And that's the whole thing. If pragmatism is what works, the only valid understanding would be long term, right? But how do you know long term? You'd have to be in the future before you could determine what the long-term thing was, to determine what works. So this is no test.
Can you not necessarily look forward, but look back and say, well, lying did not work here, and here? Or because of the extreme relativism, this situation, even if it's extremely similar to something that was in the past, is still its own situation, and so I can't determine what works until I see the future?
Well, that would be nice if we could go by history, but can you even know what actually happened in history? I mean, this is because there is no ultimate truth, so we don't even know what actually happened in history. And if you look at our culture today, all the studies show people lie all the time. It's huge. It is just, it's actually acceptable. It's no longer seen as a sin unless you're the one getting lied to. Because when you get lied to, did it hurt?
Yes.
Yes. It hurts. So you can't say, oh, just as long as you're nice to everybody. No, lying to someone hurts them. And but people lie more today than ever. And so we see this, but how do you know what works? That sounds nice. You know, we can't know what's true because there is no ultimate truth. But so we'll just go by what works. This is Dewey was the major guy who basically is the person who implemented our modern educational system. And he is the founder, or one of the, not the founder, but one of the propagators of pragmatism. It's the first American philosophy. The philosophy of pragmatism. Dewey is his name.
Dewey. Oh, okay.
And so, what we see this, you just have to ask, well, what do you mean by what works? You ask the kid. Okay, the kid lies, gets away with it. You ask, was that acceptable? Well, just ask the kid. Would the child appreciate it if the parents in turn lied to him in order to get their desired goals? I'll give you $20 if you mow the lawn. Okay. I'm not going to give it to you. They wouldn't like that, right? No more. So,
I want to see the money
you
up
can't
front.
say it's okay to lie to your parents, but it's not okay for them to lie to you. I mean, do you see this? But we're arguing that way because all of us still have a sense that there is an overarching moral code. We all have a sense that it's wrong for you to lie to me. Right? It might be okay for me to lie to you, but it's wrong for you to lie to me. Okay. And so we have this radical pragmatism. I do have something here I wanted to read from the Convergent Church. It says, I, Mark, once dated a wonderful young lady who at the time was uncertain of what direction she wanted her future life to move. During conversation, she would occasionally comment that whatever she did with her life, she wanted to be sure that she remained true to herself. That phrase always bothered me, and I never could quite figure out why. After all, isn't it important that our lives be what we want them to be? After all, isn't it important that our lives be what we want them to be? What I didn't see then is much clearer to me now as I have begun to study and consider the influences of postmodernity. The idea of being true to oneself is all about expressing and living the qualities of integrity and authenticity. On one level, this is outstanding. While the scriptures do not use the language of being true to self, they are replete with admonitions for purity of heart, clarity of... Where did this idea that everybody's right come from? Before that, where did the New Age movement come from? Hinduism. It came from that one religion. Hinduism seeking to take over the world. Only a different mask, a different understanding. Hinduism, along with its view of karma, that really work, what you do, is what's going to bring about our salvation. Whether the salvation is just here and now in this world, or if you bring into a spiritual component of it, just so long as you're good, everyone eventually will make it in, kind of a thing. And all of these different religions are based basically on works. There's only one religion that's based completely and only on grace. You know what it is? Christianity. Because we say we are so bad, we can't do anything to save ourselves. That's how dismal an outlook we have on humanity. But God is so good that He did everything for us by sending His Son to die for us. And He simply offers salvation as a gift if you'll put your trust in Him instead of yourself. All of the religions reject that. So we are unique. We're not the same as everyone else. You might be able to make a case that all the other religions are similar in that regard, that it's works. But you can't make that case for true Christianity. So, that is postmodernism. I want to show a video clip, and this will cause us to think a little bit more about postmodernism. And then we'll think of your questions so we can sum this up and then move on to the next section.
Everybody these days is talking about postmodernism. But what does that term actually mean? We now find ourselves in a situation whereby almost everyone we meet will universally agree that some fundamental changes are taking place in our culture. But what is actually taking place? What does this term postmodernism mean? And what questions and issues does it raise for the Christian? How can we begin to communicate the Christian gospel in a meaningful way in a cultural context whereby many of the words and their meanings have been changed, where there is no longer that immediacy of contact between where we are coming from and where society at large is? What does the Christian message have to say into that particular situation? The term postmodern, of course, doesn't really mean that much in and of itself. The word post means that which comes after, and the term modernism refers to a different system of thought, namely that which was reigning in our culture up until a few decades ago. And it literally means nothing more profound than that. Of course, maybe one of the most important things to realize as we talk about postmodernism is this, is that postmodernism has been born not as a result of disagreement with modernity, but as a result of disillusionment with modernity. So whereas to disagree with something is to rationally reject it, to be disillusioned with something is to experience it and find it wanting. And it was the experience of modernity and the failed promises which it did not deliver on that has given rise to a cultural context of disillusionment across Europe and most of the West. And now we suddenly find ourselves in a situation which we call ourselves postmodern. And it is into that situation which we now want to try to bring a message to speak meaningfully to the people who describe themselves as postmodern. In order to understand what postmodernism is, we need to understand and stop and reflect for a few moments on what modernism actually was. Modernism was a system of thought and a way of life which reduced everything into the material. It was a system of thought and a way of life which told us that we lived in a physical world, but in which there were no metaphysical categories. There was nothing which comes after the physical world. It was a way of life and a system of thought which told us that we lived in a natural world, but that there was no supernatural element in it, and no supernatural element in our lives. And therefore, the only thing which we should really concern ourselves about, and the only proper study for the mind, and ultimately for the heart, would be that of engaging with the material world around us. Because if we go beyond that, we're literally moving into categories which don't exist. And it is the reduction of everything into the material that has made it possible for the disillusionment to arise. There are many different ways which we could illustrate that, but I'd like just to take 3 ways and explain why those have given rise to this deep feeling of disillusionment which we now have.
I'll just stop there. Fascinating teaching that it gives, but we'll move on here. Okay, so what is postmodernism? Very simple. Relativism, open to spiritual. Extreme individualism, though they are disillusioned. I like his term there. It's not a reaction against, because a reaction against or a disagreement with is the mind, right? Okay? There is no truth, so you can't disagree with, but it's a disillusionment of, because it's all heart. It's all experience. It's all what they feel. So someone plays in over here. Oh, okay. Sorry. And so we see this huge rejection of rationalism. Rightfully so, I would argue, because rationalism cannot be a good final authority. But to pendulum swing in reaction against it and to reject it completely leaves us in feelings where my feelings and your feelings are just different feelings. And so there is no truth, but there has to be truth. Rationalism, reason at least, makes a great servant. And we need to use our reason because God gave us brains. Okay? It just can't be our final authority. As we've argued already, if God has spoken to us in an authoritative way to where we can be certain there is no error in it and that is His words, then that can be a successful and satisfying final authority. Because God is good and He is great and He knows everything, so what He says must be absolutely true. If there is a God, then He is the sponsor of the meta-narrative, the grand story, and if He's revealed that to us, then we can know for certain what that story is and what our place is in that story. That's if there is a God and He has spoken. That's why all of this, as I started at the very beginning, remember I talked about epistemology, right? Knowing what is true. How do we know things? That knowing things, if God has revealed the truth to us, then we can be certain of that, even though we are finite, sinful, and so forth. And then we have His revelation as the supreme authority, but we still use our brains. We also seek the Lord who helps us get the cobwebs out of our brains even, because I think He renews us. If the Bible's correct, then every aspect of us is infected by sin. Not just our emotions, not just our actions and wills, but also our minds. Even our ability to think is infected by sin. But if there is a God and He redeems us, He then can, as He says in His Word, gradually transform us, even our minds. And we're to love God with all of our heart, with all of our soul, with all of our mind, and with all of our strength. So we certainly are to use reason. And we certainly are to use emotions. And we are certainly are to be active and use our wills. But our supreme authority is God's Word. That's the biblical worldview compared to the postmodern worldview. So let me ask you now, compare these. Which one, and we have Christianity, modernism, postmodernism. Which one makes the best sense of all of the facts that we've been looking at so far? And just if you, any questions you might have concerning all this. It's interesting because we're not postmodern, are we? Somehow it passed us. Seinfeld feels very comfortable just in living stories.
Modernism. You said that started back around the 16th, 17th?
Yeah, 17th century.
What was the driving force behind that?
I would argue, and people disagree on what the driving force of that is, but I would argue that it was a combination of some things. That you had, first of all, the scientific revolution. Okay? Scientific revolution, all of a sudden, people are discovering things. And it's amazing. And it's good. People are discovering things. And from that, these discoveries, these inventions, great things are happening in the world. But from that, because they're discovering them, science is obviously all here, right? Science has nothing to do with emotion or anything like that. It's all facts of the physical world. So they're discovering these things, and that moved people to be more focused on the mind than the heart. With that, they also, in these discoveries, the scientific revolution, they are emphasizing the mind. With an emphasis of the mind, you also at the same time had the philosophical revolution. So you have all these philosophies coming along too. So it's very heavily mind-centered. And not only that, but there were some wars that had taken place over religion just prior to that. The 30-Year War was an absolutely devastating war to Germany in particular. 2/3 of the population wiped out by the war over religion. Lutherans, Catholics fighting each other. And that created along with this, so people are starting to use their minds, starting to think, they look at that, they go, oh, that's horrible, we don't want that. That's because of religion. And so there was a movement away from arguing over religion, but focusing instead on the mind and on what we can do. And then you had scientists who, like Copernicus and Isaac Newton, especially Isaac Newton, who discovered that the universe really looked like a great machine. So the universe is this grand machine, and it's kind of like God made this machine, wound up a clock, and then just left it there. And so everything was mechanical, so everything was focused on the material. And people who were too emotional, they're the ones that fought and seemed goofy and crazy and so forth. So the person who used their mind was very solemn, or not solemn, very calm. And emotions were simply downplayed completely. With that whole thing, so then that just carried on from there. But when we got to the 60s, there was a reaction to that. And it was like, wait a minute here, a disillusionment of that. Wait a minute here, this isn't right. I have a heart, I have feelings. And so the pendulum swung from all mind and no heart to all heart and no mind. Okay? And Christianity has always said, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind. A balance. But putting God first in his meta-narrative so that everything else fits underneath that. But when we put ourselves first, and then the chaos.
Well, in light of all three, with Christianity, we have the truth, or in Christianity is the truth, and people are disillusioned, and relativism doesn't lead anywhere except for a downward spiral. And so in that, we have great opportunity to share today more than ever what's truly what's good, and people are hungry in a sense for that, because people are depressed because of their thought patterns and how they go with this relativism. It leads to nowhere.
Yeah. If this is all there is, my story, and I don't like my story. Yeah, this is as you said, Elizabeth, this is an excellent time for evangelism. And if we will see this as that and take advantage of it, reaching out. Now, obviously, it's going to be different, as he brought out. People think differently. So how do we reach them? Those are things we want to think through. How do we reach them without compromise? Because that's the danger that, remember I talked about the 70s. the Jesus movement, they definitely sought to contextualize to the people there, but without compromise. Today it seems like we're trying to reach them, but it's with a complete compromise, which is, if we look just like the world, why would they come here? We're redundant. If we're completely the same as the world, why would they come here? If we try to entertain them for instance, they got the best entertainment. I'm sorry, Christian movies are awful. I know you all have your favorites, and they have wonderful stories, and they move your heart, but they're awful. we can't compete. So why should we? I'm not saying don't. I like throwing jokes and movie clips and stuff, but I'm not trying to compete. We compete by sharing the truth, as you said, because it still resonates. We know deep down there is a right, there is a wrong, there is a truth, there is a lie. Yes?
And Christianity is the only one out of all those that has the answers. Mm-hmm. The other ones have no answers whatsoever. Mm-hmm. I think that goes along with it, that we can give answers.
We have the answers. Islam would claim they have the answers, but as we saw, so they're definitely, they have not bought into the postmodern idea. But as we saw, they're found seriously wanting in their answers. But Christianity does have the answers. Okay. This is postmodernism. Let's see what we have next here. Let me recap the Christian worldview. We started out, we looked at the Christian worldview, then we looked at all these other different worldviews, comparing them to the Christian worldview. I want to recap the Christian worldview. Then next week, our final week, next week's our final week, right? Our final week, we are going to answer tough questions people ask. Okay? How, with the Christian worldview, do we answer the problem of evil and suffering? The idea of exclusivism, that Jesus is the only way. Some of the other problems. Bring your questions, okay? The questions that people are asking you are the questions that you have. And we'll seek that last time to be a time where we answer how these difficult questions that come up. And the problem of evil and suffering is probably the biggest question. Okay, the biggest antagonist towards Christianity. So we'll definitely spend some time on that one. But let's recap the Christian worldview here first. God, in these 7 categories that I gave of the Christian worldviews. God is transcendent and immanent. He is holy and loving. He is triune. So he is beyond us, but he also relates to us. That's transcendence, that's immanence. He's holy. He does care about sin. That is very serious to him. But he's also loving and has provided a way for our forgiveness. And he is triune. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit make up the one God. Metaphysics. God created the cosmos ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing. So there was a time when there wasn't anything but God, and God created the universe to operate with a uniformity of cause and effect, which is why Isaac Newton discovered that the universe looks kind of like a machine. Okay? He did put in here the universe to operate with a uniformity of cause and effect in an open system, though, where God does have interaction with the universe and is in complete control of the universe. There is a spiritual and a physical realm, as well as a battle of kingdoms. There is an evil kingdom and then God's kingdom, and they are in battle. Humankind. Humans are created in the image of God, but fallen. So there's aspects of us that are like God. We are not gods, not little gods, but we have the ability to reason. We have the ability to love God and to love each other, those kinds of things. The image of God, but it's been shattered because of sin. When sin entered the universe, it destroyed us, and it brought about a curse upon the world. Axiology means ethics. Ethics are based on God's character, so there are moral absolutes. That'll be one of the questions we'll ask next week as well. Are there moral absolutes, or is everything relative? But God's character, ethics are based on God's character, so there are moral absolutes because God doesn't change in his character. Epistemology, knowledge is possible because God has spoken in his word. Salvation is from sin by the grace of God through faith in Christ. So everyone recognizes once again that there's something wrong. We say the something wrong is sin. And therefore, the solution to that something wrong is God's provision of grace through faith in Christ. And meaning, what is the meaning in our life? What is our purpose? We are created by God to glorify, love, and serve God in a personal relationship. So you have the glorify and that serve part. That emphasizes his transcendence. He's God. He's not just a human being. But he is immanent as well. And so that loving relationship that we have with him. So a unique relationship with God. No other relationship is like our relationship with God. Because he is God. He's transcendent, but he's also immanent. And so we have both a loving relationship, but we also recognize a fear relationship where he is holy and he is God and we revere him. And that's the Christian worldview. So next week we'll look at the problem of evil and suffering. I like that picture. And then any other questions you have. Okay, any questions now so far what we've talked about?